Good evening. You are listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight from Central Florida, I also have Professor Pixel, the young 20-something guy from Central Florida, like myself, because as we all know, I'm broadcasting you from the Pine Hills Palace, a.k.a. the Pine Hills Collinswood main port or something. Because I got to tell you, Pixel, since we're talking about Dark Shadows Revival from 1991 episode 2, I, one thing we didn't really talk about a lot was the intro last week. I know we talked about the setup and a few things here too, but in our episode by episode review of this condensed version of Dark Shadows, Dan Kerr's phenomenon from the 60s and 70s, regurgitated here in the early 90s, I gotta sit there and say the thing that struck me is even though we had a miniature Collinsport, Maine mansion and it looked kind of like 10 cents worth, it's still, there's something about miniatures that still pulls you in as long as they're done to scale or something like that, because the damn voiceover with that stupid theme and her and all that just hooked me right in this episode. I know we left off feeling fulfilled after the last one, but I enjoyed this episode and it picked off at the opening scene very good, which I'll jump into here in a minute. But I loved it. I'm like, man, give it to me, give it to me.
It is really something perfect, isn't it? Oh my gosh. The show didn't have the miniature, but I was very impressed with the miniature. And I love the logo. It's so perfect. It comes together just how it should. Yeah, no, I love this episode too. And it's quite strange, quite strange. And I have quite a bit to say about it because Daphne Collins is a unique creation for this show. However, her story isn't wholly just written up together. This is brand new. No, this actually borrows from the movie in, I believe, 1970, House of Dark Shadows, which was a retelling of Barnabas Collins, except it was the dark version where Barnabas was no hero, and he was the dark vampire that you were expecting. And just going ahead and starting with this episode, like I said, we get Daphne. She's getting treated. Dr. Woodard is there, and he has his suspicions about who might really be behind this attack, and he suspects a vampire. And he goes ahead and he puts a crucifix right by her and says, "You need to make sure you need to be watched," but you can tell. So she has a deputy and, of course, her lover, Joe Haskell, there to stay with her through the night. And that's just the opening. It's a little drawn out, but it's in that way that you need it with Dark Shadows.
Well, and the reason it's drawn out, I think, is very important because that's actually what I want to come on. There's a lot that happens here as the setup for the episode with Daphne. There, we get Dr. Woodard walking in, and I gotta say, he's a low rent, poor man's version of Dr. Loomis from Halloween with the jacket stuff. And there's a lot I'm gonna say in here because Joe, I find a disgusting character, so much so that I'm gonna really shit on him for this episode. He's a good looking, hunky kind of guy with a 5 o'clock shadow, but this scene, it's a serious scene because obviously Daphne is near death, and we know what's going on at the end of the episode. And what I like about so far here too is that it's really not that far removed from all the main characters. That there possibly might be something supernatural here, but to what extent we don't know, but we'll get answered here because of course the doctor says, "Hey, humor me, wear this cross for me, please." And there's some interesting shots here, but it's a very deliberate, slow setup. And even though it's the pilot last week was 2 hours, this is less than an hour, 45-minute runtime here. It looks like it just feels like it picked up where left off, and so I give credit to whoever edited this to make it feel like, yeah, we're in the middle of a serious emotional thing here because we remember how we left off. So that's kind of how the emotional state we're going to be in if they continue with it rather than something else unrelated. Oh, let's get back to this plot. So I like that continuity. The problem I have with Dr. Woodard and then eventually Joe, but with Dr. Woodard is that, there's various psychological types of things that people discuss when human characters come and evolve. And one of those is never trust a man who's got a beard because he's wearing a shield on his face because he's deceptive, kind of like glasses. And, somebody that's unkempt doesn't look professional, all these things. He just looks like a slob to me. And his acting was very stilted to me. And I felt like it made the whole scene come apart. Like, here's a guy that just doesn't have the chemistry with everybody else here on the set. And the problem I have with that is I think Joe has it as well. And I'm like, oh my God, am I just seeing it because I don't like this guy? The difference is I'll come to hate Joe here very quickly, whereas that the doctor kind of picks things up here, Dr. Woodard, because you never trust a man with a bow tie. I'm just going to come out and say it. I know that's blasphemy in a lot of circles, but it's just not a professional thing. I don't know how to say it. And in the 80s, you could be a nerd, you could wear glasses, be a dork, but if you wore a bow tie, you were lucky to make it out of the decade here. And he's got the John Lennon glasses and everything. But when he takes the other doctor out in the hallway and says, "Hey, I'm going to tell you why I think this is the case," and they have a discussion, we're realizing, oh shit, the whole idea about this this detected unknown cell that everyone's finding in all their blood samples here for the attacks is going to be a major, if not very deciding plot point to it. And Joe's just there for hunky eye candy and nothing more. He's proved absolutely no worthwhile value whatsoever, as we'll soon find out. But one thing I can say about Daphne, all these women here are just natural beauties, just very cute and very
Oh,
80s
definitely.
soap opera-ish, filterish kind of style here too. It's a very soft lens that we're working with.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think actually it's funny that you mentioned Joe before, and I want to touch back on that because out of all the characters, and each character has like a distinctive look that is from the original show,
Hmm.
and how obviously they did their best to stick true to that. So like you can see visually, you could see Julia here and see Julia in the 60s. She's a little softer here of her voice actually, which throws me off a little bit, but I think she's fine.
It's dreamy.
Um, yes, yes. But Joe is pretty much visually perfect to his former actor. They look very much the same, except this one has facial hair. That is the major difference. So when we're talking about Joe here, I can understand what you're saying about him feeling disconnected from the rest, but Joe is almost supposed to feel that way. They just haven't had that build up to allow for that, I feel. I don't think he's a poor actor. I think he needs some more time. But obviously, things are going to happen which will take us elsewhere. Joe falls asleep, getting back into the happenings of this episode. And as evening comes, Barnabas Collins steps out into the gardens of Collinsport, and Daphne is summoned. She takes off that crucifix because she can feel the her I'm trying to recall what exactly the term is, but her vampiric lover right out there calling for her, and she goes to him just fully. They're asleep, so it doesn't really matter. And she goes, and it's very weird that you're kissing your long lost relative, Barnabas, but he goes ahead and pretty much sucks her dry. She's found that next morning by Joe and the deputy as they find her missing from her bed. They run out, and there she is, and she's covered in blood. She goes from
Messy.
yeah, yeah.
Not like
Barnabas.
Walking Dead sloppy, but more of a like Fulci Splatterhouse kind of blood.
It's kind of good though. I
It
think it's
is.
really good because in the former show, obviously they had vampire attacks, and they could mess them up a little bit, but they couldn't do something like this. This looks monstrous, and that's perfect. And we talked about like pacing, how much they have to fit in. We skip right to a burial, right to the funeral.
Yeah.
There's no time to grieve. They go ahead, they put her in the mausoleum, and they go ahead and have their little ceremony, a dinner afterwards. And it seems like Dr. Woodard goes ahead, talks to Julia again about, I think that she may have been a victim of a vampire. And this comes later in the evening, whenever they're having their dinner. people are over because they're celebrating Daphne's life, mourning for her. But David doesn't really care. He's outside and he's throwing this silly ball as he's playing by the
And
abandoned
he's
pool.
wearing a bow tie as well.
Oh, well, yeah, but he is evil, isn't he? But he's throwing this ball, and he says basically, "If Daphne, if you're still alive, I'm gonna catch this ball." And he keeps catching it. Does it again. He catches it, and that's when there's this voice, David. David. She steps out of the fog, and you can see her hair has just boom, it's big. Somebody I was watching with said said, what happened? I know she died, but how did her hair get so big? I said, well, that when you're a vampire, you get like 10 times sexier, and that's what's happening here.
Yeah, a couple of things I thought was interesting because the scene where Daphne dies and Joe discovers from that point on is where I pivoted into hating Joe and not minding the doctors. But we get the hey, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. Let's switch roles because they're alternating Joe and the inconspicuous deputy there as far as watching her and all that. And I thought, you know, in the last episode, I failed to point out a scene towards the end where or actually, in this episode, there's a scene coming later that I thought would have been nice to see something here, little effects, because we're asked to believe a lot, with vampires and everything else. But for me, I'm going, haven't you ever heard of coffee? And I love the fact that it's still leftover 80s here where everybody's smoking everywhere. That's kind of cool. But I'm like, they both conk out and don't wake up at all because they're apparently very heavy sleepers. I mean, it's a little ludicrous and ridiculous, but whatever kind of half joking stuff I talked about with soap opera filters for the lenses and stuff here, I am not joking because the scene where Daphne in her trance, takes the cross off and goes out to uh, be Barnabas's victim here. Holy shit, do they amp up the fog in here? I mean, you think there's a fire going on behind you. You can't even see what's going on. And I guess this was filmed during the day, but they put like a filter on to make it look at night because I always remembered when I watched this back in the 90s, just how it had this weird look. It's not dark, but it's kind of misty and dreamlike the way it is. And she's got this beautiful flowing gown on. And the point you made about them making out is absolutely 100% true because it's very erotic, it's very passionate or whatever. But it made me want to say one thing we didn't talk about with him is his teeth because he's got just great natural teeth. They don't look like crappy 50-cent inserts or whatever. And I think it's absolutely a very erotic scene. It's very good.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and then
Uh,
to kind of mention about the pacing when they find her body, and if you look everywhere except for the body, it looks all smoky. And this is filmed on, I think, called the Greystoke Mansion in Los Angeles. So the grounds are a lot of gardens, everything. It's beautiful. It definitely is a great stand-in. And then I thought this scene was interesting because I guess it's during the day when they're having this funeral, and of course it's pouring rain, and Barney's the only one out there, not under an umbrella, and we see everybody there. I like this. This is just a little different. You always have these sad sack scenes with funerals, and they don't really lack any emotional punch. But here, it's raining. You can kind of feel like it's cold. Um, I kind of liked how they were going on through it, and they just cut through it. It's like, well, yeah, they're not screwing around. And then when the doctors meet, and he says, "Yeah, I think it's a vampire." And he goes, "I know it's crazy. Nobody'd like to believe me, but Julia, the bug-eyed doctor who came in, that's got the old wet panties for Barnabas. It looks like to me. She takes him seriously, which is good because it's ludicrous, right? But it makes sense. And now we're all saying, how does nobody fucking see it? Well, we've got two smart professionals involved here with everybody, at least on a peripheral right now, and they have this discussion about it. She says, "Yeah, ever since we've been discovering these samples, I've been working on the vaccine for it." And
mhm.
I'm like, "Oh, this is what they decided to do, and how this is the major plot point. Oh, okay. Now how are they going to get it to Barnabas?" So instead of being kept in the dark about a lot of stuff, we're seeing what's happening, and now we get to go, okay, now how's it going to happen? So I like this kind of pacing that goes on here too. And yeah, the thing here when he's playing ball, saying, "Oh, if you're alive, if I catch it, you'll be alive." Beautiful lavender behind him and all this, the sun setting, and even more fog. It's tremendous. It never fails to impress me how incredible it looks for such a cheap effect. And it's cheesy her calling out, right? But when she comes out
Mhm.
with that big poofy hair, that was typical 80s ladies hairstyle. That's not even teased. It's just volume enhanced. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
But I thought it's a great look. And the dinner scene too, I gotta mention Roy Thin's hair, the Invaders guy. He started off on soap operas. He's kind of hunky in his own way, and he's in his 50s now. He's a rock, and he seemed kind of like a dick now, but now we seem like he's just kind of like, yeah, whatever. But we get to see a different side of him. And Joe here is just in. I want him to die at this point because he's like, I saw her, and he's like, yeah, I saw her too, but it's just our imagination. And he like hugs him, and like this guy's a good looking guy. I'm not saying he's a bad actor. It just doesn't fit. It's not working for me
I
with this guy Joe. I just it's so bad. I know what he's supposed to be doing, but it feels forced. You're not seeing that?
I see it as because at the
He's a
beginning of this
wuss.
scene, when David
He's a good
comes
looking hunky
in,
guy, and then he opens
when
his mouth and he's yelling and screaming when she dies in the funeral and this. It's like, oh come
Well,
on,
when
dude.
David comes in and enters the dining room, I saw Daphne because he escaped.
Yeah.
And everyone is saying, "Oh, I love Roger, David. That's enough."
Yeah. He's
He's
the
so
man house.
tired, and uh, at
Joe's got
first,
the wimpy
Joe
1-inch turtleneck too.
Joe
That doesn't help.
there you go.
I'm
But
sorry.
Joe starts off. He's like, "No, you didn't, David. That's impossible. We buried her." And then he does. You're right. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to basically say, "Oh, listen, David. I see her too. I miss her as
It's
well."
not
And
even
he's trying.
condescending. It's just phony.
Yeah, it's not meant. It's I. I
There's a
can
way to
see it.
do it where you come across as being genuine, even if you don't believe it yourself, and maybe I'm putting a little undue burden on him for having to be
Yeah.
that guy, but just every scene he's been in, when he gets emotional, he's awful. He just needs to be a meathead and shut up.
Well,
Sorry.
well, that's going to be funny for later. But Dr. Woodard goes ahead and decides, okay, you know what? Dinner's the perfect time to tell everybody my theory about the living dead.
This is awesome. Everything just all the shit hits the fan always at dinner things. And let me ask you this too.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a giant family dinner scene like that, whether it's a TV show or movie, and shit's going down, right?
Hmm.
I find myself always staring at the table. Do you do that too? Just seeing how they've staged it? I want to see what they're eating,
No,
how many sides they
no.
have. Oh
I
yeah.
I'm the other way around. I can't I'm just so focused in on the characters who's gone ahead, they're sitting together where they're sitting and talking to each other. Um
The maid comes
and
in from the right, which is the
Yep.
correct way to pour water, and they do the right thing by not speaking to the maid. They just put their hand over their cup. Little nice old English touches, like that. I
It's
like.
it's definitely strange, and I know it might not seem like it considering that the staff play a major part in the story of Dark Shadows, but it's definitely strange to have servants in Collinwood for me because in the original series they do not. They because uh, Elizabeth has basically kicked out all the staff because she's like holding a secret, and they glossed over that for this,
Right.
which is understandable because they want to get right to the meat of it. And we should do that here. Joe, pretty much at the behest of Dr. Woodard, basically says, "We need to check her grave. We need to go." And Joe does that. He goes to her tomb and enters and sees it's open. And who's that calling him but Daphne? And she goes ahead, and you said he needs to be a big hunk of meat. That's how she treats him there. And she starts drinking, and then just leaves him wandering, have blood drained from him around Collinwood.
I was glad
Yeah.
to see him die, and I hate to see that, but it just you know what he is? He is a no talented piece of meat, Matt Bomber. Just hunkier and maybe a bit beefier. That's all.
Well, he didn't die here, but
I'm just saying. That's what he is.
but here it actually goes into the next evening because they are able to find Joe. I love that we get like glimpses inside of the town, and we get strange things are going on. There's actually a part of this episode, and you know what? I actually don't have it listed here, but this is very strange. Roger goes into town to the bar. I'm pretty sure it's in between here.
Yes, it
And
is.
he goes ahead and visits Maggie Evans. And Maggie Evans in this version of Dark Shadows is, yes, Sam's daughter. Sam wasn't the bar owner in the original series, but here she is in love with tarot cards, and she gives like full credence to him. So here she goes ahead and Roger says, "Well, you know, I think he says something about Victoria would like you to come over to Collinwood." Well, that's not where they exactly go.
Well, they
Um,
do. They're on
well,
the estate of
they're
they're
on
on
the
the Collinwood
estate. That's
estate.
right. That's
Yes.
right. And in a messy little hut, and they go making
It's
more
an
of a
artist
mess.
retreat. Have you ever seen one
It's
that wasn't cluttered? I'm just
that's
saying.
true. But no, it's very funny to see. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's bad. It's definitely interesting. Um, but yeah, no. Roger talks about, and we get some insight with Roger. He talks about how, oh, I've traveled this world and I've seen some strange things in my time, but strange things here, Maggie. And Maggie went ahead and pulled. I wish I could remember the card. I can't. But basically, it's to give a. It's a dark omen of things to
It's the
come.
death card. I think
The
it's
death card,
13.
was it?
I think so.
Well, that makes sense considering where we go next. But I know you want to say something about Roger and Maggie.
Roger's the man. Because I gotta say this about Maggie. Maggie is the hottie of the group. She's got the sultry sexiness that's different than the prim and proper, yet very elegant, beautiful. What's her face, played by Joanna Going, whose name is escaping right off the top of my head, and because we haven't seen her much in this episode, actually, yet just like we haven't seen much of Maggie in the previous episode, and of course we can tell as soon as they get outside that he's stooping her, and they're not married or anything, so there's nothing illegal about it, but it is a somewhat older middle age woman. There's an age difference between or whatever, but it's interesting because they're of course in the artist studio there, and again, fog is everywhere in town, and she's mounting him and riding him basically in her own seductive way, and she's got that old wife beater shirt on type that chicks would wear a lot more of back in the 80s, along with a denim skirt. And what I liked about the scene here was we don't have to see the sex act to know that they're having relations, right? And there's
Yeah,
nothing really wrong or illicit about it, yet we know that they're not necessarily advertising it for whatever reason. We're not getting a use vibe out of here. But what was neat about Maggie, two things. One, and I'll be completely um, low level about this. Like I say, she's very sexy when she's getting up and sultry looking. I'm going, oh, is she going to be like some sort of temptress? No matter what, she is a witch after all. But in the 80s, just to educate you and the audience members here, like that might be younger, checking out Dark Shadows, we were joking earlier about some of the things that happen in movies. Since we're an 80s based channel here on the Xtreme Movie Show, the 80s was not afraid to show women wearing basically stuff like that with their nipples popping out or whatever like that, and sweat. They did a really, really good job here with the sweat machine, the oil or whatever, to make it look like they were having a passionate sex or whatever. But it's cool because the nice little bit of acting is like, well, when you want some coffee as an adult, you're like, aha, she's avoiding what's going on here. And he goes up to her, and this is where Roger's smart. He's got some humanity in him here. They're kind of talking, and she's like, yeah, I just think things are going to get worse. And he almost kind of agrees with her. And it's like, this is just a nice little bit of characterization where we could see a little bit more of these two. And we get an idea that he's not just a jerk at the front of the table or whatever. This is good, but it's hard to take your eyes off of her in this scene and him. And I'm thought, as characters, they have chemistry. I don't hate them. I don't love them,
indeed.
but it makes sense. And he seems like a source of, the patriarch of the family in a way, whether he wants to be or not. And of course, we're pretty much getting close to finishing up because the really what I would call biggest scene of the episode is the next one when Barnes shows up in the evening to pay his respects to everybody. Why don't you go ahead and take that?
Yes, yes. Uh, Barnabas goes ahead. He comes later that evening, and he pays his respects, obviously, and he explains that he went, it doesn't matter where, he could say anywhere. Oh, I just had to go to Bangor on business. Oh, I just had to go any freaking place. Uh, to go ahead and just say that he wasn't in a coffin. And he goes ahead and he apologizes for not being at Daphne's funeral, not properly. Uh, and while he's speaking to the family, they, oh, sorry, just good memories. Julia is there witnessing, and she is wandering the room as he's talking and notices the big mirror. There's this large mirror, and it looks back into the room and shows everybody
It's a good scene.
right on the couch, right in the center where Barnabas is sitting. There's nothing there. There's no one in the mirror. And yet she turns around. She has to double check because there Barnabas is. And slowly things in her mind are coming together. And with this, we're going to just take one more step just to talk about Joe, because Dr. Woodard, obviously he goes ahead and readies the men, the deputies, with large silver cheesy ass crosses.
Oh, they're awesome.
I love them. They're great.
These things are massive.
This actually, like I said, House of Dark Shadows, maybe we'll talk about the movie one day. They went ahead and did a retelling of the Barnabas Collins story with a dark way of being. And Carolyn in that movie, she's the one who suffers from Barnabas's attack. And that's what happens to Daphne here. It's pretty much beat for beat the same. And here they go ahead, they go after her, they try to hold her back. She has Joe, because she called Joe to her side. And there he is. He's shirtless. He's in a state of feeding his lover. And that's, pardon me, when one of the deputies come in, they're holding the cross. They're keeping her back. She wants to attack, but she can't in the sight of that holy symbol. And that's when they all come in. Joe tries to protect her at one point, but he does not perish in this episode. And ultimately, Daphne is held back, held down, and Dr. Woodard comes in with the stake, hammers it through her heart, and finishes her off. Oh, gotta love it when they can bring in some action.
Your stake is rising, Dr. Woodard. Because I like this scene a lot too, and to kind of close up the episode here a little bit, I think the pacing of it, like we talked about, is interesting. Like how it's a couple days later and they're immediately at the funeral, and it's a quick cut. And here it seems like the last few minutes take forever for what's going on, and we know what's going to happen, and we watch it unfold. But like the cop goes up there, doesn't see anything, starts to go downstairs. All of a sudden, there's an accidental noise, and he goes up. I'm like, what's the point of showing these cops as bumbling idiots? I don't. What was I just don't get it. And of course, it's like run into the spotlight I'm standing under. The effects aren't special, but they're good enough. And I really like how our boy Barney, we get to see him just absolutely lose it. Because here's the thing that I thought was great about these last couple scenes here to finish the episode. The Barnabas scene was pretty obvious, nobody saw it, but Julia just says, "Screw it, I'm going to go see him, whatever." And when she goes there, Willie's basically like, no, you can't. But here's the thing with Willie: even though we know he's Barnabas's lackey, he doesn't try to physically restrain her. He takes a whole different route to that kind of guy. He's not manipulative. He's not scary. He's just like, oh no, you can't do it. It seems like he's just got a little bit of like childlike humanity in him too, where he really doesn't want to see her hurt, but he's just got to do this thing because Barnabas is making him do it. And I thought this was kind of an interesting angle to it, because she just basically ignores him, goes all the way down. I thought, well, I like her being bold and assertive. I like how he's not being a complete, D-bag or prick. But I almost lost it there too, because when she gets there and opens up Barnabas's coffin, and she's got the cross, and he's like, put that away, and I give you my word, I will not harm you. And she's like, I'm only here because your word. Is like, I already gave it. And I'm like, this is a good exchange. But when Barnabas recomposes himself and meets her in the study to discuss her why she's there, he's like, good evening, Willie. Like, I'll see you later. And he almost imperceptibly just kind of narrows his eyes. And I thought, man, it reminds me of the beating scene from before, and I want to see Barnabas beat him. I just do. It doesn't get old to me. I don't know why, but I want to see Barnabas beat him some more. I don't know why.
As soon as that scene happened, he said, I'll see you later, Willie, to beat your ass.
So basically, she's got a proposition for Barnabas. Hey, I know what you are. This is what I've been doing. I want to cure you. And he's like, well, why would you do that? And he basically goes on this rant about how tortured he's been in this, lived trapped in this dark, monstrous shell for 200 years, held by desires I can no longer. I mean, he goes on this big speech. I'm like, fuck, this guy is good. He's incredible. He's the right guy here because he's playing a tortured vampire emotionally without him playing like a feral animal that we saw Jack Palance's version of Dan Curtis's Dracula from the early 70s, right? So this is kind of a slightly different interpretation. Anthony, was it Perkins, when he played it, was it 77 or 79, Dracula, he brought that more mainstream with more of the electric charisma and sexuality. This is just more of a refined combination of ways to play Dracula, because after this is like when we start getting into the emo 150-pound corpses and all that and the whole nonsense of the 90s. But he looks at her, turns his head, and said, okay, where shall we begin? And the episode ends. I'm like, yeah, this is good. This is good stuff. Love this episode. And it was basically after the second episode here when I watched it back in 91, before they started getting preempted for the Gulf War and whatnot. I said, okay, I'm in. You had me at hello, but I still was holding back. And this episode convinced it for me. I was going to watch more of this because I didn't know what was going on, but I loved it. It was great stuff. Loved it, loved it, loved it.
Oh, yes, it is really, really good. Oh, and I'm so happy. I'm so happy that I waited. But with this, I actually, in reading about the series before, learned that I'm pretty sure it was this episode was released with episode 3 on the same night. So people were privileged to go ahead and see what happens next. But you are absolutely right. It is not a soap opera. I mean, obviously, it feels like it. Okay, yes, but it's not in the traditional sense, but it has that feeling. There is no show on television right now that I can honestly say, and I like y'all are talking about Tulsa King, fantastic show. I want to see more, but nothing feels like the beginning and ending of this show because you are ready. You are ready to be sucked back into this little world that just seems so ridiculous yet so real to you. And when we talk about Ben Cross, yes, he is exactly the kind of actor to play Barnabas. He's like a stage actor, and he comes in and he brings so much emotion into every line, and it's so careful. It's like he's like a surgeon with dialogue.
It is. The deliveries, they always say that the communication is 90%, nonverbal, and the delivery is more important than the message. And I don't disagree here because I just remember he has a great speech, not say what the particulars are. And I'll say this: we're going a little later tonight here live on the Xtreme Movie Show. We're going to stream a separate one where we're going to talk about a great Western called El Dorado with John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, and Howard Hawks. And it struck me too watching both of these today that I went, they both have some similarities, and I'll end it at this, and then you can have your final thoughts, and we'll call it a night. There's something to be said for a movie that is well edited, well paced. It's simple in that it introduces things, pushes them along, doesn't overdo it or underdo it, and it's hard to be Barnabas Collins without overdoing it, but you better not underdo it. Kind of like Dr. Woodard started off, I thought maybe underdoing it for that scene, and now he's grown on me, whereas Joe went the opposite. And those things can happen, but all in all, I this is basically almost flawless for me right now for 2 episodes. It's fun, it's exciting. Episode 3 is going to rock, I hope. Any other final thoughts from you? Observations?
All I can say is I think that it's insane to me how one man is able to tell a story. And this is his third way of telling it, and he tried a fourth actually, but this is his third way of telling the same character and his story, and yet somehow each time it just keeps getting better, and not in a way that diminishes the past, but it's all so lovely. And I can't wait to come back in 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks that I come back, and we get to talk about episode 3.
It's high production values help there too. So I agree with you on that. That'll be interesting to take as we do that. All right, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Dark Shadows, the revival from 1991, season 1, episode 2 just completed. We'll be back in 2 weeks for episode 3. Pixel's going to be out of town for that time here during the holiday season, but I'll film with something else then. And I'd like to thank Pixel and everybody involved here at the Xtreme Movie Show for doing what we do here, and you guys for listening and getting the word out. Can't wait to see Dark Shadows get some more traction here as we starting in this 12, I believe, episode season. Thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening. Remember to have a good night and always stay extreme.
And The Dark Shadows is a Dan Curtis production.
You just had to get that in.
I always have to get that in.